listeners, and welcome back to the SKYLIT Books podcast series. I'm your host for this episode, Justin Remer. Today, it's another SKYLIT author discussion, and our guest is described in their bio as a queer autistic writer and teacher. Their books include the novel The Winter Night and the poetry collection I Hate Parties. They are here today to discuss their new book and ECW Press's pop classic series, It's Only Forever, Labyrinth. Please welcome Jess Battis. Hi, Jess.
Hi, thanks so much for having me.
It's great to have you here. I just finished the book earlier today, and it's a really interesting read. You know, you're discussing the film, you're discussing it in terms of your own story, because you came, what age were you when you first saw Labyrinth?
I was around 8 years old, probably.
Yeah, which is like the perfect time to see
Yeah,
it.
I think so, for that movie, yeah.
So for folks who don't know, can you talk a little bit about what the series is and also how your book fits in that series?
Yeah, absolutely. So Pop Classics is a series with ECW Press, which is a Toronto-based press. They focus specifically on kind of like a long essay style book about films and cultural phenomena and artifacts. So a classic example of this is there's a title in the series about the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, which is both a film, a television show, a toy line, a comic book. So they really strike at like things that are kind of like phenomena and cultural artifacts. And so when I pitched the book on Labyrinth, I sort of presented it as a film that has also, you know, spawned video games and comics and masquerade parties, and that's tied into the kind of broader work that Jim Henson was doing through all sorts of different properties. And I think it's in development to be there's supposed to be a sequel directed by Robert Eggers, which I think is like a really, really interesting director for that. So yeah, that's what that series focuses on. And that's really the focus of the book, which is a kind of a series of like, accessible nonfiction vignette discussions about different themes and elements in Labyrinth, not just as a film, but as a kind of cultural phenomena.
And you do talk in different sections about other films that were out in 1986 and also around the time. And early on, you mention Legend and The Neverending Story as forming a kind of trinity with Labyrinth. Is that thematic, or is that just personal? What makes that a trinity in your mind?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think I'm like the only person that actually calls it a holy trinity, but for me it certainly was. Like I was the youngest when I saw The Neverending Story. Like I was probably too young to see that in a theater. And then Labyrinth sort of comes out just after that, or Legend comes out just after that, and then Labyrinth right after Legend. So they're really on the tail of each other. And in a lot of ways, I kind of argue in the book that they're kind of different kind of windows onto the 80s and what kind of fantasy cinema culture was like. Neverending Story, adapted from Michael Enda's book, it has more of a kind of fairy tale quality to it. Then you got Legend, which in a lot of ways is kind of a moral story about ecology and about kind of not giving into temptation, and it's got a rockin' soundtrack that ends with a Brian Ferry video for some reason. And then Labyrinth in a lot of ways I think is the most ambiguous. The ending is such a weird mix of a return to normalcy versus a total unwillingness to like give into a normal life. So to me, they seem to kind of be different jigsaw pieces in the way that the 80s looked at adolescence and kind of and fantasy and storytelling as well.
You definitely talk about it in the book, but what specifically appeals to you about fantasy storytelling?
Oh yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I am myself a novelist who works primarily in the realms of fantasy and horror. As a kid, I think, you know, I grew up in like a small like hockey town and in on the coast in Canada, and it was also like part of the Bible Belt. So the big influences were like hockey, evangelical Christianity. Those were the things that were kind of supposed to structure our lives. And I think I really early on started reading fantasy novels that were in like old, like pulpy paperback editions because they were affordable. You get them at the drugstore. You could get them at used bookstores. And those stories appealed to me because there were always characters who kind of defied social conventions. Like you could be a witch and live in the forest. You could be a wizard. You didn't have to be strong. You could still kind of like structure reality with your magic spells. And I think like during the 80s, it's such a weird, I mean, we're kind of back there now, I think, but at the time there was such a weird paradox about, you know, you can do or be absolutely anything that you want as long as you have the like financial capital to do that. And then also the rise in, like CGI technology so that we could start to portray things on screen that we weren't able to before. But looking back on 80s cinema, a lot of it does feel very escapist and very kind of like focused on fantasy and on space and on we're going back to vampires and things like that. And so it was, I think that there's a lot of tonal whiplash during that time. And Jim Henson's kind of sensibility of, you know, not really love stories, human kindness, be gentle with each other. That doesn't feel to us like it was part of the ideology of like the Reagan 80s. But in a lot of ways, I think we can see him as kind of a correction to that.
Yeah. And I'm realizing now, because Labyrinth is sort of a given in my life as I assume it is for you, but maybe we should tell the listener a little bit about Labyrinth. So it is a film directed by Jim Henson, best known for The Muppets. Tell us, break down Labyrinth for us.
Yeah, it's actually kind of a funny film to summarize because the plot is, at times the plot is very reasonable, and then at other times it's almost incoherent, as most fairy tales are. The bare bones plot of Labyrinth, the film, is that you have a 14-year-old girl character named Sarah, played by Jennifer Connelly. All she wants to do is kind of live in this fantasy world of her own design, but she has to babysit her baby brother, and she hates her stepmother, as characters often do in fairy tales. And Sarah is so frustrated by her baby brother, who won't stop crying, that she wishes he would be abducted by the Goblin King, who is a character in these stories that she reads. And that's exactly what happens. David Bowie shows up as the Goblin King. He kidnaps her baby brother Toby, and he says, "You have 13 hours to solve my labyrinth before your baby brother becomes a goblin." And she's given no training. She has no special powers. She's not a vampire. She doesn't have a machine gun. She just has to solve this cunning labyrinth, which is supposed to be unsolvable. And that's essentially the plot of the film, along with a lot of like interesting characters that come in to help her. And then an ending which is very ambiguous, where you can't quite tell if all of this was in Sarah's head or if it was a very real thing that was happening to her.
You mentioned this sort of thematic thing, but I think you express it cleanly at one point. You say that labyrinths are meant to be experienced, not merely solved. Mm. How does that relate to the Labyrinth and Labyrinth, I guess?
Right. Yeah. I mean, there's a funny moment at the start of the film where Sarah nearly solves the labyrinth without realizing, because she talks to one of the most popular characters in the film, is this tiny little worm named William. And he's giving her some advice, and she's about to go down a corridor of the labyrinth, and he says, "Don't go that way, go the opposite direction." And then after she's gone, the camera zooms in on him, and he says, if she would have gone that way, she would have ended up straight at that castle, which is exactly where she wants to go. Right. So she does nearly solve it. And it's only this like little worm's compassion, thinking, who would ever want to go to the heart of the labyrinth? Because it's so scary. Sarah as a character, she's just continually confronted with all these kind of logic puzzles and riddles. And some of the riddles are unsolvable. There's a riddle involving two talking doors. and the two characters, one always tells the truth, one always lies. And no matter how mathematically you try to work it out in your head, there is no real solution. And that seemed to be part of Henson's philosophy, which is like adolescence is a labyrinth, becoming human is a labyrinth, and you're just confronted with all these impossible choices. Every time she thinks that she makes the right choice and gets confident, she's always made the wrong choice. And that to me sort of feels like growing up. So that's why I tried to kind of present different versions of labyrinths in the book, and trying to get us to think about a kind of labyrinthine way of thinking where it's not just about solving the game or solving the maze. It's the as the kids would say, it's the friends we made along the way.
Right. I think that's a good thing to remember too, because I definitely know as a kid, I think I was delighted by a lot of the things that are thrown in her path, like the little creatures that change. Like she like puts an arrow to tell her which way she's going.
Yeah.
And someone comes and turns that cobblestone and points it another way. That delighted me as a kid, and I think I watched this a few years ago, and I was like, oh, that
right, yeah.
Like I want linearity now, but I think maybe as a kid I was more able to give over to every little moment. You describe in the book at a certain point that Sarah is a queer character to you. What about Sarah makes her a queer character?
Yeah, that's a good question. One of the things I try to do, like both when I'm teaching classes on English literature and then just in general, is think about a word like queer as something that's really big and open-ended. Like originally it just kind of meant like crooked or approaching something from a different angle. And so to me, especially when I was rewatching Labyrinth as a kid, I found I connected with the character of Sarah because she's kind of an oddball. Like she's played by this attractive white middle class actress, but all she wants to do is like put on these weird plays in a park. She doesn't seem to have any friends, or even her stepmom is like, could you go on a date once in a while? Like, but you're spending all your time in your room. And for me, there's, I guess, like an essential queerness to that, like preserving your own fantasy world. And the lack of romance in Labyrinth in general, like the only real romance is this very inappropriate romance between this like immortal Goblin King played by like bisexual David Bowie and then this 15-year-old girl. She's 15 in the film, and it's never really presented as possible. But that was very different from, say, like The Breakfast Club and the films that I grew up on. So there was something about that prickliness, that difference in Sarah that I think I connected with as a queer person, because she didn't really have to. She's found ways to like avoid the big life decisions. Like, how do you keep the goblins in your bedroom and still go to work and have a pension? Like I'm still trying to figure that out. And she manages to do that. So for some of those reasons, she always struck me as a character that was kind of queer in a really interesting and open-minded way.
Yeah. And Bowie, it seems more overtly a queer character in the film. You use the phrase amazingly queer with the, maze is fairly pointed in the middle there, but amazingly queer. Talk about Bowie in the film.
He's one of my favorite anecdotes from doing research on the film is that, like, so Bowie wasn't the first choice for the Goblin King. He was supposed to be played by a puppet, and then finally, and then there were all sorts of different actors that might have played him, but it was Henson's son, Brian Henson, who convinced him to cast Bowie, because he said the Bowie is like is this right now popular artist. Like, he's going to be timeless. He's popular now, and he's going to be popular forever. And so that was one of the reasons why he was cast. But there was this detail I read about where Bowie was on set and nobody really talked to him because they were so intimidated. And one time he just kind of appeared in the middle of lunch where all the crew were having lunch, and he said, do you mind if I just have a sandwich with you? And he sat around and nobody knew what to say. And Brian Froud, who was a producer on the movie, said, it just feels weird aren't you busy? Don't you have things to do? And he said, no, nobody really talks to me on movie sets or on music video sets. Like, there was this sense of kind of loneliness and distance in his life and that's a kind of, we can sort of read that as a queerness too. As a character though, I think he's just so unlike other leading men, I guess. You know, he's dressed like he's at a Renaissance convention. He's wearing a lot of makeup. He's mostly concerned with like throwing big parties, and there's that very involved scene where he's manipulating crystal balls, which it's not actually him, it's another artist who's doing that behind his back. So he just seems kind of very, very unlike any other kind of male lead that you would imagine in a show like this. And because of his context and everything that we know about him as a celebrity, it's kind of impossible not to see him as this kind of figure that's challenging all these like gender norms and things like that.
Even the choice for him to be a human amidst all these goblin puppets, like that's as striking on its own. Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, and he looks they could have gone very kind of Disney villain with him, where he's either like a mustache twisting villain or someone like, you know, Scar from The Lion King, who's like very kind of queer coded, but in a very sort of like, he's just irritated by everything. And with Bowie, it's more, he imbues that character with this kind of childish petulance. Like, he doesn't want to be a ruler, doesn't want to be there, but at least he's going to have a good time while he's there. And if he is evil as a character, it's like a very benign evil.
That was my impression of him as a kid, and definitely still now. You talk about your affinity with goblins. Can you describe what exactly your affinity is with goblins?
Yeah, there's a book by the author Michaela Coyle called Goblin Mode, which was popular a couple years ago, and where she talks about living as a goblin as a kind of way of life, where it's like, when we think of goblins, we think of these like weird, hairy little guys that just kind of, they're not really the center of anything. They're not attractive. You kind of remove all of the social pressures. And what does it mean to just kind of like, you know, in sort of on an internet language, it's like to rot, like you're just rotting in bed. What does that mean? And so, I thought about that as I was writing about goblins, in particular because as someone who was like a nerdy kid who played a lot of role-playing games and stuff like that, goblins were always like the first creatures that you had to fight. And it was understood that like nobody cares about them. Like, they're not part of the plot. They're just, you just kind of grind through them and that's it. But it made me wonder what it would be like to kind of, what is it like to inhabit goblinhood? Is it like, staying up late and then sleeping in? Is it, you know, eating potato chips in bed, or refusing to like change out of your favorite sweatpants? Like, the Goblin Core book brings up all these examples, and I wanted to kind of apply that to the goblins and Labyrinth, because they're all kind of, they don't really have a gender. They don't really have anything that they need to do. They just kind of wait. There's one goblin in the Goblin King's castle who's just like drinking wine out of a keg. I'm like, that seems pretty cool. So just thinking about how that might align with like all the pressures of adolescence and moving into adulthood. But what would it mean to kind of short circuit that a little bit and just be a little more goblin-y?
Yeah. Yeah. You talk about how goblins make poor decisions, but it seems like it's not affecting them. They're like, I stand behind it.
Right. Yeah. They're doing well.
And yeah, I mean, you talked a little bit about it, but so because of that, the goblin party at the end of the film is such a thing of like, you know, I've solved the labyrinth, but I'm still bringing the goblins with me. What do you think the take is there? Like, what is the takeaway from that ending?
Yeah, it's funny. My editor, Jen Suk-Fon Lee, who's a Vancouver writer, she edits this series. We worked a really long time on that final chapter, talking about the kind of confrontation scene between Sarah and the Goblin King and its relationship to the ending. And she kept asking me, like, what to you is the most important thing about that scene that you want to convey to the readers? And I just kept kind of approaching it from every angle, and I wasn't quite sure. I was never quite certain why it resonated with me. But I think now it has a lot to do with the Goblin King is this authority figure telling her, like, all you have to do is admit that you're not free, and then I'll let you do whatever you want, which is it just kind of feels like living under capitalism in the current moment, right? Like, just admit that you're like a tool, or admit that you're one of my goblins, and then I'll give you this kind of secret power, but all you have to do is believe in me. That kind of gaslighting that's at the heart of that scene. And then Sarah's realization that actually, this is my story that I'm telling. I'm the one that has the power. And she does that without any kind of like real magic or special effects. It's just a thing that she realizes. But then cutting from that to the final scene where she does admit, oh, I do kind of need these weird little guys in my life, and then they show up. It's like everyone's dream. It's the same as at the end of the Neverending Story in the film, when Bastian gets to ride his luck dragon through the streets of Vancouver, and he scares those bullies, and they end up and he's like, see, you're in the dumpster now. It's the that sense that is it possible to have both? Can magic be alive and well? And I think it's kind of, everyone has to kind of figure out on their own if they believe that is possible. But it did seem to like open up this kind of rupture in the era in which the film was produced, where everything feels very heavy. And we're really seeing, it's the 80s were really the blueprint for what we're in right now. But this little film kind of suggests it might be possible to go in a different direction. So that, for me, that's why that scene is so important. Even if I'll never fully be certain whether I believe it's possible to combine both of those things.
Yeah. I mean, you discuss both kind of thematically and maybe just as a person. Jim Henson seems to constantly be stuck between childhood and adulthood.
Yeah.
I was curious, you don't bring it up, but did you ever see any of his Saturday Night Live segments with those fantasy creatures? It was such a weird attempt to be, more adult, but it just seems so odd.
Yeah, he did these early commercials in the 60s too, for a coffee company called Watkins. They were supposed to be these very kind of cute commercials with these proto Muppets, but instead he's got like these creatures that are like shooting each other and eating each other alive and threatening each other. And Watkins was like, what are you doing? You have to refilm these. And he was like, no, this is what I produced. And so he always seems to have kind of done that from the very start. Like there's a weird element of mortality and of anxiety that's infused in his work, even in the really cute characters.
In your sort of like, I mean, it's hard to sort of put intention on some, on an artist, especially someone who's long gone. But in your reading of Jim Henson, you bring up this term neuroqueer.
Yeah.
Can you discuss that term and especially how you think it relates to Jim Henson?
Yeah, sure. So this is kind of like a term within disability studies. The more common term is like neurodivergent, which I talk a little bit about as like, okay, well, diverging from what? Like it's not like one is Mac and one is PC. But like there's not really like a perfect brain to diverge from, but that's the more common term. But they're like within kind of disability studies, there's been more of a development of this idea, like, well, what if you're like, so what if your brain is queer in some way? Like, what could that mean? And in particular, like we see there's a fairly visible correspondence between like people who are queer and trans and people who are autistic or ADHD, like those two spectrums, like the gender spectrum and the kind of cognitive spectrum, they are entangled in ways I think that we are still trying to figure out. And so I wanted to use that term to think about how Henson himself, like he probably thought differently than a lot of his contemporaries, and how he kind of wants us to think differently in interesting ways. Like he's always kind of subverting and undercutting and combining humor with tragedy in ways that are really, really fascinating. Like, I don't know what Henson's neurotype was, but I feel like he and I would have gotten along pretty well. So certainly, like, he had a very intense attention to detail, an incredible focus. And there's one moment, kind of throwaway moment in his biography that I was really enchanted by, where he had just had this big finance meeting with Disney, and he was with his lawyer and they were walking, and his lawyer was rattling off this information, and he thought that Henson was listening to him, and he realized that Henson was just like distracted by the moon. He was just staring at the moon. And it's like, that is a way of thinking differently, you know, even when he was in the heart of his kind of Muppet empire that he had built, he was still this guy who was like thinking about things slantwise and queerly in a really interesting way. So that's what I meant by that term. And I think Labyrinth does kind of give us permission to think about problems in different ways. Like when the little worm says to Sarah, you know, things aren't always what they seem in this place. And you see this interesting optical illusion of a wall suddenly becoming a hallway. And the camera doesn't change at all, but suddenly Jennifer Connelly just walks through what you thought was a wall. So what does it mean to kind of think about some of these problems from a different angle?
I'm curious too, because you talk about failure or even just perceived failure a lot in regard to this film, because I mean, it wasn't a success, but also it's kind of a reaction to the reception to The Dark Crystal as well. How do you feel like the film exists in this thing of failure, I guess? I don't know.
Yeah. It's really interesting because Henson, I think he's known most for his successes, like his enormous successes, like the Muppets. Although the Muppets almost didn't get made either. The Dark Crystal was like, it was for the first time he had enough money and enough technology and just a big enough crew that he could create this story that had been kind of rattling around his brain. And it had very mixed reviews. One critic called it that beige movie. Like, and it's true. There's like a lot of like brown hues. It is a slow moving film, but also a really, really fascinating one. So I think Henson was really aware of that when he was working on Labyrinth. And he was like, we're going to do everything we can to make it as exciting as possible. It's going to be a musical. It's going to be fantasy. There's going to be puppets. We're going to cast this like a very marketable young actress. We're going to do a huge marketing campaign. And it was pulled from theaters after like a couple weeks because it did so poorly. And the criticism ranged from like, we didn't like Jennifer Connelly. She wasn't convincing as a teenager. But a lot of critics just said it just doesn't seem to come together. Roger Ebert said, he said it has no heart, which to me is like, that must have felt so terrible for Henson to hear that. But it was a film that it failed for reasons that we can't fully understand. But it also emerged from a failed concept where the script went through like 50 different revisions. Mm-hmm. There were 6 to 12 different writers at one point. There was something about that story where he just couldn't quite make it come together. And I think that's maybe one of the things that makes it so appealing now, that it is an imperfect film. And it kind of gives us permission in a way to tell our own imperfect stories. It's a story about the baggage that you accrue when you become an adult and how you have to give up your childhood. But it's also about this like weird swamp that makes fart noises. And that was Henson's favorite part. So it's the imperfection, I think, is what makes it the most appealing now.
Yeah. When I was in high school, I was becoming a Monty Python nerd. So when I realized that Terry Jones was credited with the screenplay, I was like, oh, I should really revisit Labyrinth. But then also finding out, he's like, well, yeah, I don't think that was totally my script, but I appreciate the credit or whatever. Yeah.
Yeah. Nobody knows who actually wrote it in a way. Like it was based on children's stories. And then Maurice Sendak was involved at one point. Then he accused Henson of plagiarizing one of his stories, created a rift between them. Terry Jones was involved. Like it went through so many hands, but you can, I think, see Terry Jones's influence because the funniest scenes like the the little knight that looks kind of like a weird fox / chihuahua, like that's got Terry Jones all over it.
Yeah, definitely like some personalities and some dialogue definitely feels like that. One of the chapters in the book is specifically about the color green.
Oh yeah.
What made that stand out to you to base a whole chapter around this color?
Yeah, that's part of it has to do with just like personally, I am someone who teaches the literature of the Middle Ages. And so a very important piece of literature for me has been the poem Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, which has also been adapted many, many times, where the color green is very mysterious. Like, why is this guy green? We're not sure. What does green actually mean? And I thought of ways to connect that with Henson's famous psalm that Kermit sings about being green. What does it mean to be green? The challenge of this is that we could not quote from the psalm for rights reasons.
Sure,
and so we had to craft a discussion. And the same thing that we could not quote from any of the Psalms from Labyrinth. So I'm writing a book about a musical, but I can't quote any of the Psalms. And it sort of forced me to approach the scenes in slightly different ways. Yeah. But I was very interested in how the film does kind of have a specific color palette, but green pops up in weird ways, like this swamp, this bog that's always threatening people. It's this like horrible green. And if you watched films in the 80s, there's always this like gross out humor that was very kind of specific, particularly to the late 80s, and trying to explore, well, what does that mean? Because when Kermit sings about being green, he's not sure if green is a good color. He wonders if I'm green, I kind of blend in, but maybe it's good to be green. Whereas in Labyrinth, we're continually told that the last thing you want is to kind of fall into this bog because you'll smell forever, which is going to make kids laugh. But also, I think it gets the older audience to think about, well, what does it mean to be like marked that way or different in some way? Is it possible to kind of choose green as this slightly awkward color?
I was terrified of that bog as a kid.
Right?
I was like,
yeah,
I wouldn't want to be that. I wouldn't want to be smelly like that. No,
you don't want to be the stinky kid, right? Because kids notice that. I can remember even bringing my peanut butter and jelly sandwich to elementary school and thinking, I hope nobody like smells the peanut butter because then they'll make fun of it somehow. Like, there's so much surveillance when you're that age, and there's something really funny about watching Jennifer Connelly negotiate this like set piece fart joke and just, this is just one more thing to be solved. Like, as it turns out, the film presents these consequences, but they're very silly. Like, and sometimes life can be like that, kind of tragicomic and silly. So it's always getting us to kind of question, okay, what are the real consequences? What does this really mean for this character? This is the things that are so important to you when you're younger. You're probably not going to care at all. Although I'm always enchanted by the fact that Brian Henson said that his father, he used like an old Moog synthesizer to create all those fart noises. He wanted each rock had to have a different fart noise, and he said they could barely get through the takes because Jim Henson was laughing so hard in the background. It has nothing to do with really the film story, but that's just kind of his sense of humor.
It's also funny that he had to have it played on set too. That's really good. Yeah. Just as a side thought, I wanted to say, now knowing what you said about not having the rights to do the lyrics or anything, that never came to mind. I was never like, why aren't they like quoting the song straight? So
it's very tricky. Like there are titles on that series where they will quote from a film. Like I'm allowed to quote from the film as long as it's not a lot of quoting, and often copyright doesn't really distinguish where it's really like the amount that the publisher is comfortable with. But song lyrics, it used to be a little more possible to do this, especially with indie music. I just read this great memoir by a music critic named Nico Stratus called The Dad Rock That Made Me a Woman. And when she quotes from these songs, I kept thinking, I'm not sure how she's getting away with this because, okay, it's a bigger publisher, but generally we're told like maybe a couple words here and there. But you'll notice in that book, it's like never more than one line is quoted at once. So yeah, these are issues that kind of come up when you're doing like pop culture studies. You got to be really careful with how you approach it.
Yeah. I was going to ask, I am not a Labyrinth hardcore, so where does the title come from? It's Only Forever. Is that from a song?
Yes, it's from the song that plays at the start and at the end of the film called Underground. And it's this this song that Bowie did. It has a lot of like funk elements to it that are unexpected. But he sings "It's only forever, that's not long at all." And I was enchanted by that line and how it kind of it sort of queers the notion of time and childhood, and what is that what childhood is? Is it forever and also not long at all? What does it mean to go underground? Like, it's never really explained. And so that kind of opened up a lot of possibilities for me for thinking about how the film is really focused with the kind of weird, shaky transition from childhood to adulthood, and how the memories that you build up in childhood, that phase really can seem like forever. But now as I get older, I'm like 47 now, it distresses me when I try to remember certain elements of my childhood, and I'm like, where did that go? Like I thought obsessively about that thing for months and months, and now it's just I can barely access that visual of what that. But then there are certain moments that are just forever frozen because they were like moments of trauma or moments of embarrassment and things like that. So I think the film gets us to sort of think about that, how we move from childhood to adulthood and the nature of time in both of those phases of our lives.
You talk about trying to find things in movies that sort of spoke to you in any way. I really like the section where you talk about Otho and Beetlejuice.
Oh, good. Yeah. He's such an obscure character.
But can you talk a little bit about him?
Yeah. So Otho is this like interior designer in Beetlejuice, Tim Burton's Beetlejuice, played by this character actor named Glenn Shaddix, who's no longer around. He was acting at like the height of the AIDS epidemic, and Tim Burton cast him as this like comic relief interior decorator character, where they're trying to, spruce up this haunted house where these ghosts live that Winona Ryder will eventually become friends with. And he's only supposed to be comic relief, but the actor imbues him with this kind of like sense of like refinement and elegance. And given how like gay men in particular were usually like the butt of homophobic humor at this time, ranging from like playful to violent, Otho was kind of an unusual character in that he has like real empathy for the ghosts in the film, and we're not quite sure what happens to him at the end, but he seems like he's fine. As a kid, I remember going to see that in Vancouver and not really understanding like what. I have felt some kind of kinship with this character, but I wasn't sure what it was. And at the time, I think I like understood that this character was gay, even though nobody was saying it. And it was a very interesting choice of Tim Burton's to have this kind of sympathetic character, because we weren't really seeing that in other films. And so I think it's a similar sensibility to Henson's that Burton has, like the romancing the oddball, the weirdo. And there's a similar, I think, queer sensibility there.
Yeah. And you talk a little bit about how Winona Ryder is Lydia in that film, right?
Yeah.
How like her story isn't, there's not like romance at the core of her story, which kind of makes the sequel such a disappointment, because then they're like, what do we do with Jenna Ortega? I don't know. She wants to hang out with a boy and he's dead or whatever.
That was frustrating. Yeah. my partner was really frustrated when we saw that movie, because the ghost kid keeps talking about 90s vinyl, and he was like, what is he talking about, 90s vinyl? Like, is this kid just like shoplifting new vinyl from like where is this coming from? Such a weird plot problem. But yeah, in the original Beetlejuice, yeah, I think it's a similar kind of trajectory with Sarah that Winona Ryder's character has, where like she doesn't really care about boys. She needs to get good grades, but that's about it. She says, famously, "I myself am strange and unusual." She's like a goth kid, and both Burden and Henson, I think, were interested in exploring kids that age who like weren't really normal. And I found both of those films, I think I liked them growing up because there wasn't that emphasis on romance. Sometimes like, because there were so few films in the 80s that actually like depicted a queer romance, virtually none. The only one I can really think of that does it positively is this indie film that nobody remembers that had Steve Buscemi in it called Parting Glances. Sure. It's actually like quite well written, but it was definitely the minority. Sometimes like the queerest thing you could do in an 80s film was just like not have a romance, because otherwise it was so enforced. And I kind of I often in that book summon up the film Top Gun as the model for like what you're supposed to do. We didn't like at the time Kelly McGillis was like not out as a lesbian, so I think we didn't really know what was kind of going on behind the scenes, but that was the model for masculinity. Although the hilarious thing is if you watch like the music video for the song from the volleyball scene, the Kenny Loggins song, it's like the gayest music video possible. It's so bizarre. It's just hilarious. But I think, sometimes just even having a film that didn't have that intense romantic drive to it was kind of a relief, because at least you knew that the character wasn't getting kind of pushed into a traditional relationship at the end.
Yeah. If the story of Labyrinth isn't all in Sarah's head, what do you think is the appeal to Jareth of Sarah? Because it's not romance.
Yeah, it's very confusing. In a song that he sings to her, he says, "I can't live within you. Like, I can't just be whatever, this figment of your imagination." But to me, it's very unclear what he actually wants with Sarah. Henson says that in interviews, he says that when she goes to this masquerade party, there's all these adults there dressed as goblins. And he says it's like that moment when you're a kid where you wander into like a really adult situation and you can't quite interpret it. And so she kind of wants it, but doesn't want it. I mean, I don't think she wants it. Like, she breaks a crystal ball with a chair and flees. So it doesn't seem like she wants it, whatever it is. But what the Goblin King wants with her, I think it never becomes fully clear, except that maybe he wants her to stay within this fantasy and not interact with the real world anymore, or stay under his control somehow. It also makes me think, though, about there's a philosopher named Lauren Berlant, and they talk about this idea of cruel optimism, which is like what happens when the things that we strive for are actually shitty. Like the things that are our big dreams and goals, they actually are harmful to us, and we don't realize it. And it's very hard to sort of figure that out. Because as someone who did a lot of academic training, I was very, very invested in becoming like a particular kind of academic or a particular kind of writer. And neither of those things exactly happened the way I thought they would. So I wonder as well if there's a sense of he wants her to hold on to this dream of hers, which is maybe not doing her good in the way that it should. Like, maybe she should go on dates, or at the very least should have friends. But I love that Henson leaves it like really gloriously unclear at the end. There's that scene where the weird goblin that has like a bird that lives on his head, he's just like dancing around with he's like got streamers in his hair, and it's so ridiculous. And Brian Froud said, "Oh, I hated that ending. I thought it was so it just feels kind of so unserious." And Henson, but that was obviously the point. Like it's not a film or a story that settles on like one ending or one meaning.
Like, that's another one of those aspects that as a kid loved it just without thinking. When I was a little older, I was like, that's maybe a little cheesy or something. But now I think I've come back around again. So
now at my age, I almost sympathize with her stepmother, who just, she's like, really, it's like the one day that we go out on a date and you show up and you're like dripping wet and you're being really difficult. And all you need to do is watch your baby brother for a couple hours. Like, all my friends are parents who have kids ranging from like 8 to like 17 now. And I can kind of see her perspective. Whereas, and she says, she keeps turning me into this wicked stepmother. So in a way, Henson is kind of pointing to like the tools we have as kids, which are often fairy tales and stories like this, and saying, yeah, they do have something to teach you, but also don't be limited by some of these perspectives too. Like, not every stepmother is an evil stepmother.
I like that. That's a really nice note to end on. So thank you so much for talking with me today, Jess.
Yeah, it's a real pleasure.
Is there anything apart from the book that you would like to plug here?
Let's see. I don't really have anything specific coming out right now. I have like a lot of projects in the background. All I would say is just like the book comes out on April 7th, and pre-orders are really important, like both to presses and to authors. So if you could pre-order and review, I'm always willing to kind of send a review copy to people as well, just to kind of get the word out.
You can get it from us personally, skylitbooks.com. If you're in Canada, you should get it from a lovely Canadian bookshop. But yeah, if you come to our shop, it'll be in the Arts Annex, 1814 North Vermont Avenue. We'll have some copies of It's Only Forever, Labyrinth. Thanks again so much for being with us today.
Thanks, Justin. It's been a total pleasure. I hope I can visit SKYLIT Books in person one day. I don't get out to LA very often, but it would be really nice to visit.
Oh, nice. Yeah, we'd love to have you.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the SKYLIT Books podcast series. We hope you enjoyed it. If you'd like to check out the book featured in this episode, or others, please visit skylitbooks.com. If you're in the Los Angeles area, stop by for one of our live in-person author events. You can find a calendar on our website. If you like this podcast, leave us a review. It really helps us out. Our music is by Duck the Piano Wire. Till next time.